Hey everyone, Jonathan here from the Land Method. Just sitting here enjoying a cup of coffee. And I thought what I would do was kind of jump on for a moment and just talk about some cheaper land that we bought and what we actually made on it. Because I think a lot of times people talk conceptually, but they don't necessarily give details and give information and things like that. They just, oh yeah, there's tons of properties out there that you can buy for X and you can sell for Y and all that, right? But let's talk about some actual deals. So when a lot of people hear cheap land, they immediately go, their mind just goes to what's the point, right? They assume that if you're buying a property for a few $100s or a few $1,000s or even 10 or $15,000, that the profit is going to be small too. But that's not necessarily how land works. And I'll say necessarily because if you do it right, there's plenty of people out there that are buying properties for $15,000 to sell them for 20. But if you're doing it right, that's not how it works. So in this video, I'm going to walk through a few recent real examples from our own business where smaller land purchases turned into strong profits. And basically, it was because of one thing. We understood the deal before we bought it. And that's one thing that I keep reiterating. You really need to understand things ahead of time. And that's where land gives you a huge advantage because you have the ability to do that up front. You're not getting into like a can of worms like sometimes in a house when you're like ripping something open and it's like, oh man, this is what was hiding behind the walls and things like that, right? This is something you can basically know everything you need to know pretty much up front. So when it comes to land, like I said, sitting here, sipping some coffee. So people only look at it in terms of price. They ask a question like along the lines of how cheap can I buy it? And that's the wrong question. A better question is what's the spread? You got to know who's your buyer. What problem does this property solve for somebody? What's my best exit strategy? Because money in land is not made just because you bought something cheap. The money is made when you buy the property right, which does mean the right price, but it also means the right exit strategy and knowing what those options are in advance. And that's what separates a real land deal from just buying cheap dirt and hoping things come together. So I want to give you three recent examples because they show different parts of this business. And they're not all the same kind of deal. One was a cash purchase. One property is one that we bought. Well, they're all cash purchases, but one was a cash purchase that we sold for cash. Another one was a cash purchase that we sold again for cash because it fit a very specific buyer type. And then one was a property that we bought again very cheap. And then we had an issue with the property, an issue that we knew about in advance that most beginners would probably run away from, but we understood this, we addressed it, and we ended up making massive return on investment in profit in that deal through owner financing. And what I just said is important because land investing is not just a single strategy. It's not just buy cheap and sell higher. It's understanding the property, understanding the market, understanding the buyer, and knowing which exit strategy makes the most sense. So let's go through these different examples for a moment to help you with that. All right. So our first example, we bought the property for $12,000. We sold it for $40,000. Now, again, like I just said, we bought it for $12,000 cash. Now, this is not a huge purchase price, right, in real estate terms, but it's also not one of these $500 purchases. And it was a unique piece of land. And that matters because it wasn't the type of property where every buyer in the market was going to flood to it and immediately understand or want it, right? It needed a specific buyer. It needed someone who saw the same potential that we saw. But before buying it, we understood that. So we weren't buying it blindly and just hoping for that. We looked at the property, we looked at the area, we looked at the possible buyer pool, and we recognized that there was a fair amount of room in the deal. So we bought it for $12,000 and we sold it for $40,000. So that's a $28,000, gross profit. I mean, it was a little less than that because the closing costs and other expenses, they weren't much, but obviously those are something. But let's just say, 27, 26.5 in profit or somewhere in that. So the lesson in this is not just to go buy $12,000 piece of property and hope that they sell for 40, right? The lesson is that some deals require you to understand the uniqueness of that property. A beginner might look at that kind of land and then they say, I don't know, right? It seems unusual. I don't know who would buy this. But that's where experience, where research, where proper valuation come in. Not every land deal is going to be obvious at first glance. Sometimes the opportunity is there because other people just don't know how to evaluate it. Our second example, we bought a property for $590 and we sold it for 9,000. Now that seems like a very big spread, right? Now, let me give you a little background on this to explain why we were able to get it so cheap and why we were able to sell it. So this property was on a dirt road, which is fine, right? It had access, but it didn't have any utilities. Electricity was about 500 feet away from the property. Now, for some buyers, that would immediately be a deal killer. If someone wants to build immediately and they need power right there, it's obviously not going to be the right fit. There's no question about that. But just because it's not a right fit for that person doesn't mean the property has no value. The property had open zoning, and that in itself opened up the buyer pool. So we ended up selling it to someone who wanted to use it for camping. That buyer didn't need power. They were not looking at the property the same way a builder would look at it. And this is one of the biggest things that new investors miss. I tell people this all the time because people look at a property and they say, would I use this? That's not the right question. The right question is, who would want this property? What would they use it for? Does it match a certain type of buyer's needs? See, in that case that I just mentioned, no utilities on the property, it didn't matter the same way because the buyer's intended use for it, it didn't require them. Now, if zoning didn't allow it, then that would be a big issue, right? But because we understood the details of what was allowed there, we could market it effectively like that. So what does that translate into? Well, we bought the property for $590. We sold it for $9,000. So again, that's $8,400 in gross spread. And in that case, that really was our profit because we self-closed on the first end and then the buyer paid all the closing costs on their side. So that's how a small, low-cost deal can still work. Not because the property is perfect, but because the property fit a specific buyer and we understood it. All right. The next one I'm going to talk about is a property we bought for $530 and we sold it for $8,000 using owner finance. And I really like this because this deal shows where problem solving comes into play and why it matters. So it was a very low acquisition cost, but it had an issue. There was a neighbor using the property to access their own land, which was behind it. Now, a lot of people would immediately panic when they see something like that. They would just assume we need an attorney. That's the way the seller felt. They would assume that the deal was ruined. They would assume there's no way to fix it. But that's not always the case. So we knew about this issue and we understood what was happening. So we sent the neighbor a letter and we explained the issue and we told them basically that you need to stop using the property that way. Well, interestingly, they reached back out to us and they had zero problems with it. And they said they understood completely well. It was received fine. They basically said they were just doing it because they could, but if we're not okay with it, fine. So it was resolved without an attorney. And that's a huge point, right? Not every problem has to become a lawsuit. Not every problem has to become this major complicated thing. Sometimes if you understand what's going on and you communicate it clearly, then you can solve that problem directly. And what was interesting about it is the person that was using it to cross it actually wanted to buy it from us for cash. So we had one possible exit there, but they weren't offering quite what we wanted for it. And we also had another buyer at that time who wanted to purchase it with owner financing. So we sold it to them. I believe the neighbor was offering us 6 cash. The owner financing was $8,000. But because of fees and interest, our total profit ended up being over $15,000 on that property from a $530 investment. And so that's another powerful example of where structure matters. If we had only thought in terms of a quick cash sale, we would have made money. Don't get me wrong, but we would have left in that case, $9,000 on the table. So owner financing allowed us to create a better return and also help this buyer who wanted the property but needed those terms to do it. And it's just bringing this up now because he just finished paying that property off. So this is another huge part of land investing. Sometimes the highest return doesn't come from the highest cash offer. In fact, oftentimes it doesn't. Sometimes it comes because of having the best structure. So the real lesson here in all of this is that land investing is not one strategy. Take anything else away from that, just realize that it's not a single strategy. These examples that I've shared, they are completely different. One was a $12,000 cash purchase that sold for $40,000. Again, creating about $27,000 in profit. One was a profit that we bought for $590 that we sold for $9,000. Again, because the buyer wanted a use that didn't require utilities and we understood the zoning. And in that case, we're walking away with $8,400 in profit. And again, an exponential return because we only paid $590 for it. And then on the $530 property that had the issue, we resolved that. We understood what was going in. We tackled that, and then we sold it with owner financing, ultimately creating over $15,000 in profit on a $530 investment. And that's why I always tell people not to think of land investing as just, a narrow-minded one strategy. There are different property types. There's different buyer pools. There's different acquisition prices. There's different exits. There's different ways to make money. But the foundation of what we're talking about, it never changes. You need to know what you're buying. You need to know what it's worth. You need to know who's likely to buy it. You need to know what problems might exist. You need to know how you're going to exit before you commit to the deal. You need to know these details that are underlying on the property. And honestly, that's where most people get in trouble or quit because they feel like they can understand it. Some mess up because they buy it first and then they figure it out later. Others just quit. But if you buy it first and you're trying to figure it out later, that's completely backwards, right? You don't do it that way. You figure out things in advance. So I will want to say one thing though, cheap does not always mean good. I want to be very clear about that. It's not automatically a good deal. And that's also a huge mistake that beginners make. People see a property for $500 or $1,000 and they assume, oh, it just has to be a deal. There has to be something there because the price is low. That's not true. Price does not equal profit. Sometimes cheap land is cheap for a very specific reason. Nobody wants it. There's very little value, all of those different things. It has no access. The zoning's too restrictive. If I brought that up, that property, if there was restrictive zoning, would have created a lot of issues. Would have been a hard move. Probably still would have made some profit at that price, but nowhere near as easy of a sale. Maybe the terrain is unusable. Maybe taxes are too high for what it is and you can't get them reduced. Maybe the market simply has no demand. People aren't going there. Maybe every comparable property is just sitting there for years for some reason. So you don't want to ask the question, can I buy it cheap? There's plenty of cheap properties to target if you don't have a lot of budget, but it's not just because they're cheap. You still need to take it further. So the question is, can I buy it cheap enough relative to what I can sell it for, the real market value, the real buyer demand, my real exit strategy? And those are very different things. Once you understand that, you stop chasing land, cheap land, and you start looking for good deals. And every one of those things that I just mentioned was a good deal. And another point that I do want to make is that small deals do matter. This proved it, right? A lot of people want to skip straight to the big deals. They want the $50,000 profit. They want the $100,000 profit. They want the massive home run. And don't get me wrong, those happen. And if you have the ability to go after those, then go crazy, right? But the small deals, one thing is there's a lot more of those. They also teach you the business very well. You learn how to talk to sellers. You learn how to evaluate properties. You learn how to solve problems. You understand buyer demand. You learn how to market, how to negotiate, how to close, how to structure owner financing, because those are amazing for owner financing, like I already showed. And when you can do that on smaller deals, you basically are building the skill set that you're going to use on the larger ones, right? Nothing changes. You're just adding zeros in that case. But again, there's a lot more of the smaller ones, and it's just a lot less intimidating to people. A lot of people want the big deals, but they freak out when they see those extra numbers for their purchase price. Whereas when you're paying $500, $1,000, $1,500, like I was mentioning, a lot of people don't have a problem with that. And so that's one of the reasons, even today in my business, I don't dismiss these type of properties. A $530 buy that turns into $15,000 in profits, that's not a small deal. That return is incredible, right? And so that's a lesson in leverage and structure and problem solving, right? Or that $590 property that sells for $9,000 because I understood the buyer is not just looking for a cheap piece of land. They were looking for a very specific use, and that land would accommodate it. And it still had potential for growth because obviously when utilities come in, it's going to be worth a lot more. So that right there is showing that if you look at these things and you find out what can happen, you can match the property use to the buyer demand. And, the $12,000 piece of property that we sold for 40, it was a flip, but it's more than a flip, right? It's a lesson in seeing value where others may not, because a lot of people would have shied away from that property because of basically the type of buyer that was going to need it. So there is a system behind all this, right? That's how we've done over 1,500 land deals. It's not because every deal looks the same. It's because our process is consistent. We find motivated sellers, we evaluate their properties, we understand the markets, we make conservative offers, we do our real due diligence, which is huge. We understand who our buyer pool is based on that. We choose the right exit. And then we move forward only when and if the deal makes sense. So that's the difference between running a land investing business and not just randomly buying properties. Land can be simple, and it is simple compared to other types of real estate, but simple doesn't mean you get careless with it, right? It doesn't mean you just throw money out there because it looks like a great deal. You still need a process. And when you have that process, you can look at the property and you can say, well, this is one that I just need to pass on. It doesn't make any sense. Or this is one that I'm going to need to flip or even double close because I don't want to tie up money. Or this is one that's going to be a home run for owner financing, like I showed you. Or this is one that I definitely see the potential, but there might be a little bit of a delay because it's going to take a very specific buyer. By the way, I'll talk about that in another video, but that one I just mentioned, the one about any very specific buyers, are some of the best potential deals out there because so many people overlook them. And then there's other ones, right? Like I just mentioned, there's a problem on the property, but it's solvable. And looking at all of those things, that's where money is made. So when someone asks, can you really make money on these smaller land deals? The answer, as I've proven, is absolutely yes. And again, it's not because the land is cheap. You make the money not because you bought it so cheap, because this still works on even higher properties. You make money because you understand the deal, because you're buying it right, because you know your buyer, because you are solving problems, because you're choosing the right exit strategy. And sometimes a property that looks small on the front end can become a very strong deal on the back end, right? A $590 property can become a $9,000 cash sale. A $530 property can become owner financing that generates over $15,000 in profit. And a $12,000 purchase can turn into a $40,000 sale. Those are just three examples. But again, none of these happen just because the purchase price was low. It happens because the deal makes sense. And that is the land business when it's done correctly. So if you're new to land investing, or you're looking at it and you're comparing it and all of these things, then, and you want to understand all of this, then start with our free introduction to land investing course. It walks you through the basics of how we find sellers, evaluate properties, make offers, and think through deals before buying. The link for that is in the description. And if you want more complete step-by-step system, you can also check out our Land Riches Blueprint course, where we go much deeper into the process that we use in our business from start to finish in any market, and break that all down. But start with the free course, learn the fundamentals, and then decide if this business makes sense for you. So thanks for joining us, and I'll catch you next time. Have a great one, everybody.